photograph appeared on screen. Jonathan Bailey stopped mid-sentence, stood up from his chair, and walked off stage without any explanation. Jimmy Fallon stared after him, frozen. The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon. Studio 6A at Rockefeller Center. Wednesday night, November 2023. The studio was packed. 300 audience members, cameras rolling. The Roots providing musical punctuation to every joke. Another perfect night of late-night television. Jonathan Bailey was the guest. The British actor who became a household name through Bridgerton and Fellow Travelers. Charming, witty, perfectly comfortable in the spotlight. He and Jimmy had been having a great conversation, laughing about behind-the-scenes stories from his latest project, trading anecdotes about the chaos of filming period dramas. It was going exactly as planned, the kind of smooth, entertaining interview that makes late-night television look effortless. Jimmy glanced at his Blue Note cards. "So, Jonathan, I heard you had a pretty wild audition story for your first big role. Want to share that with us?" Jonathan smiled, leaning back in the iconic orange guest chair. "Oh, absolutely. This was years ago. I was fresh out of drama school, and behind them on one of the large studio monitors mounted on the set, a photograph appeared. It was meant to be a fun visual aid, something the producers had pulled from Jonathan's early career. Standard late-night show stuff, a picture to accompany the story. But this wasn't the right photograph." Jonathan's voice stopped. Not a pause, a complete stop, like someone had cut his audio. His eyes locked onto the monitor. His face animated and expressive just seconds before it went completely blank. Jimmy noticed immediately. "Jonathan, you okay?" Jonathan didn't respond. He was staring at the photograph with an expression that wasn't confusion or surprise. It was recognition and pain. He stood up abruptly. The movement was so sudden that Jimmy actually leaned back slightly, startled. Jonathan turned away from the desk, away from the cameras, facing toward the backstage area. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said, his voice tight and strange. I need a moment. I'm sorry." And then he walked off stage. Jimmy stopped mid-joke. The entire studio froze. The audience sat in stunned silence. The Roots stopped playing. Questlove's drumsticks hovered in midair. Jimmy sat behind his desk, his mouth slightly open, his note cards forgotten in his hand, staring at the empty guest chair. In the control room, chaos erupted. "What's happening? Did he just leave? Do we go to commercial? Why did he walk off?" But Jimmy wasn't listening to his earpiece. He was looking at the photograph still displayed on the monitor. A simple picture, black and white, slightly faded. Two young men, maybe in their early 20s, arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something off camera. One of them was clearly a young Jonathan Bailey. The other, Jimmy, stood up. He did something he almost never did during a taping. He walked away from his desk, past the cameras, and followed Jonathan off stage. The cameras kept rolling. The producers didn't cut. Everyone understood they were witnessing something real. Backstage, Jonathan was standing against the wall, one hand pressed against his forehead, breathing hard. Not crying, not yet, but fighting it. A production assistant was asking if he needed water, if he was okay, if they should call someone. Jimmy appeared in the narrow backstage corridor. "Hey, Jonathan. What's going on? What was that photo?" Jonathan looked at him, and Jimmy saw something in the actor's eyes that went beyond stage fright or embarrassment. This was grief, raw and immediate. "That photo wasn't supposed to be there," Jonathan said, his voice barely steady. "That photo it's private. It's from my personal collection." "How did you?" He stopped, shaking his head. "It doesn't matter. I can't go back out there right now." "Who's the other person in the photo?" Jimmy asked gently. Jonathan's jaw clenched. "His name was Oliver. He was my best friend from drama school, and he died 11 years ago, and I haven't looked at that photo since the funeral." The backstage area went completely silent. The production assistant stopped moving. Jimmy's expression shifted from confusion to understanding in seconds. "I'm so sorry," Jimmy said. "Jonathan, I'm so sorry. Someone in production must have grabbed the wrong file. We didn't know." "I know." Jonathan wiped his face roughly. "I know it was a mistake, but seeing him like that on that screen in front of all those people, I wasn't ready. I thought I'd move past it, but apparently I haven't." Jimmy looked back toward the stage, toward the cameras still recording, toward the 300 audience members waiting in confused silence. He looked at his producers who were hovering nearby, waiting for direction. Then he made a decision that defied every rule of live television. "We're not cutting this," Jimmy said to the producers. "We're going back out there, and we're going to talk about Oliver." If Jonathan's okay with it. Jonathan looked at him sharply. What? Listen, Jimmy said, his voice firm but kind. You can absolutely take the night off. We can reshoot this tomorrow, or we can cut to a pre-taped segment, or we can do whatever you need. But I think maybe this happened for a reason. And if you want to talk about your friend, if you want to tell people about Oliver, we can do that right now on camera. Make something good out of this accident. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. To understand what happened next, you need to understand who Oliver was and why that photograph mattered so much. Jonathan Bailey and Oliver Mitchell met on their first day at the Guildhall School of Music and Drama in London in 2008. Both 18, both terrified, both convinced they were the least talented person in the room. They became inseparable almost immediately. Study, partners, scene partners, best friends. They pushed each other, supported each other, stayed up late in Oliver's tiny flat running lines and arguing about interpretations and dreaming about the careers they'd have someday. The photograph on the Tonight Show monitor had been taken at the end of their second year. They just found out they'd both been cast in a small production at the Southern Playhouse, their first professional gigs. They were celebrating at a pub near campus, and another classmate had snapped the photo. Two young actors with their whole futures ahead of them, arms around each other, laughing. After graduation, they both started getting work. Small roles at first, commercials, background parts, and TV shows, theater productions that paid barely enough to cover rent, but they were doing it. They were actually working as actors. Oliver was talented, not just competent, genuinely gifted. He had a quality on stage that drew the eye, a naturalness that made even small roles memorable. Jonathan always said Oliver would be a star before him. It was just a matter of time. In 2012, Oliver was cast in a West End production, a supporting role, but in a major show. Opening night was scheduled for October 15th. It was the breakthrough he'd been working toward. On October 3rd, Oliver was riding his bicycle home from rehearsal. A driver ran a red light at the intersection near Covent Garden. Oliver died in the ambulance before reaching the hospital. He was 22 years old. Jonathan spoke at the funeral. He talked about the first time they performed a scene together, how Oliver had made him laugh so hard during rehearsal that the instructor had separated them. He talked about late nights and impossible dreams and the kind of friendship that shapes you when you're young and scared and figuring out who you want to be. And then he'd stop talking about Oliver, not because he'd forgotten him, but because the grief was too heavy to carry in public. Jonathan threw himself into work. More auditions, more roles, constantly moving forward because stopping meant feeling the full weight of loss. By 2023, Jonathan Bailey was famous. Bridgerton had made him a global star. Fellow travelers had earned him critical acclaim. He'd achieved everything he and Oliver had dreamed about in that tiny flat, running lines at 2 a.m. But he'd done it alone, and he'd never quite forgiven himself for succeeding, where Oliver never got the chance. Behind the scenes, Fallon made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. Jimmy and Jonathan walked back onto the stage together. The audience erupted in uncertain applause. They didn't know what was happening, but they were relieved to see both men return. Jonathan sat back down in the guest chair. Jimmy sat on the edge of his desk instead of behind it. A subtle break in the usual format that signaled this wasn't going to be a normal interview anymore. So Jimmy said to the audience, his voice gentle, "Something just happened that wasn't planned. And Jonathan and I talked backstage, and we decided if he's comfortable to share it with you, because sometimes television gets real, and that's okay." He looked at Jonathan. "You want to tell them about Oliver?" Jonathan took a deep breath, nodded. "The photograph you saw on the monitor?" Jonathan began, his voice steadier now. "That was my best friend from drama school. His name was Oliver Mitchell. We met on our first day at Guildhall. We were both terrified teenagers who had no idea what we were doing. And we became everything to each other. Brothers, basically." The studio was completely silent. 300 people leaning forward listening. Oliver died in 2012. Jonathan continued. Hit by a car while riding his bike home from rehearsal. He was 22. He was about to open in his first West End show, and he never got to do it. And his voice cracked slightly. "I haven't talked about him publicly since the funeral. I thought I'd moved on, but seeing that photograph tonight, I realized I haven't. I've just been avoiding it." Jimmy's eyes were glistening. Several audience members were openly crying. "What I realized backstage," Jonathan said, looking directly at the camera now, "is that Oliver would have hated me keeping him a secret. He wasn't a secret. He was brilliant and funny and talented, and people should know he existed. So, I'm glad that photo showed up tonight, even though it hurt, because now I get to tell you about him. But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Jimmy reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his own phone. Jonathan, I have to show you something. When you walked off stage, I had our producers do a quick search. Oliver Mitchell, drama student, West End actor, died 2012. Is this him? He turned the phone screen toward Jonathan. It showed an article from a London theatre blog dated 2012. Remembering Oliver Mitchell. A bright light gone too soon. Jonathan stared at the screen. Yeah, that's him. That's Oliver. There are a lot of articles, Jimmy said quietly. People wrote about him. His instructors, his fellow actors, critics who had seen him perform. Jonathan, your friend, was remembered. People who knew him never forgot. Jonathan covered his face with his hands. His shoulders shook. The studio stayed respectfully silent. Jimmy set his phone down and did something he'd never done before on his show. He reached over and hugged his guests. No joke, no punchline, just one person comforting another while millions watched. When Jonathan composed himself, Jimmy made another unprecedented move. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small leather notebook. The one he used to write monologue jokes and sketch ideas. This is where I write down everything I don't want to forget, Jimmy said, showing Jonathan the worn cover. Stories, moments, things people tell me that matter. I want you to write something about Oliver in here. Just one sentence. Something you want to remember forever. Jonathan took the notebook with trembling hands. He wrote carefully, then closed it and handed it back to Jimmy. What did you write? Jimmy asked softly. Jonathan's voice was barely above a whisper. Oliver Mitchell made me braver. He still does. The audience rose to their feet. Not the excited applause of entertainment, but the quiet, reverent applause of people witnessing something sacred. Jimmy stood too, still holding the notebook. Thank you for sharing him with us, Jimmy said. Thank you for letting us know, Oliver. After the show, Jimmy had that page from his notebook professionally framed. It hangs in his dressing room. Below Jonathan's handwriting, Jimmy added one line. Air. November 2023. The night we remembered why we do this. Share and subscribe. Make sure this story is never forgotten. Jonathan now speaks about Oliver in interviews. He dedicated his next award to him. The photograph that accidentally appeared that night became the cover image for a scholarship fund created in Oliver's name at Guildhall School. And every year on October 3rd, Jimmy Fallon posts that photograph on social media with the caption, Oliver Mitchell remembered. Always. Sometimes the best television moments are the ones that weren't planned. Sometimes the camera needs to keep rolling when everything falls apart, because that's when we stop performing and start being human.